The Greek War of Independence by David Brewer, book review. So this is a book about the Greek War of Independence, also called the Greek Revolution. This has to do with the modern state of Greek, so it's not about ancient Greek or anything. It was from 1821 to 1830. Now, if you bear with me for a little bit, I'll talk a little bit about the background to this, or how I got interested in the subject in the first place. Because it is arguably one of those obscure things, or at least obscure to an American audience. I had never really heard of this before until I was reading Bulfinch's Mythology a number of years ago. Which I did as a abridged version as an audiobook. Now, Bulfinch's Mythology was written in the 19th century, and it was meant as an introduction to mythology. And the whole point behind the book is Bulfinch was trying to introduce mythology to the modern reader, what was then the modern reader. And he was saying, look, you need to know mythology because it pops up in all these references to literature. And if you don't know the mythology, you're going to miss the references in literature. That was probably more true in the 19th century than it is today. But, you know, he was writing in the 19th century. So he'd tell a story from Greek mythology, and then he'd say, okay, now here's all the ways it pops up in modern literature. And a number of different times, he would illustrate this by a quotation from Lord Byron, where Lord Byron seemed to be referencing some sort of revolution or war in Greece. One that sticks in my mind is a quote from Byron addressing the Greeks. "You have the letters Cadmus made, think you he made them for a slave?" Or something like that. So there was some sort of big political revolution going on in Greece that was obviously a big deal at the time when when Bulfinch was writing, or when Byron was originally writing. But it's one of those events that has kind of been forgotten in history, or again, at least from an American perspective. So that first got me curious. It's popped up again in a few different books I've been reading. For example, Washington and Lafayette by James R. Gaines, a book I've previously reviewed on this channel, talks about the Greek Revolution in the 1820s and the tremendous sympathy that the American people felt for the Greek cause. You never hear it nowadays, but apparently it was a big deal at the time. Gaines references it because apparently the United States, because of the Monroe Doctrine, right, the Monroe Doctrine says, okay, we won't get involved in any European wars, and we don't want Europe getting involved in any wars on the American continent, I believe was the Monroe Doctrine. So because of that, America was officially forbidden from expressing the American government was forbidden from getting involved in the Greek War of Independence, or sending any aid, or expressing any opinions. But then when Lafayette visited America in the 1820s, he received an incredibly overwhelming welcome, which Gaines said this was an indirect way for Americans to show their support for the Greek Revolution, because Lafayette was a famous supporter of the Greek cause during this time. So again, I thought, oh, that's interesting. You know, one of those things that nobody ever talks about now, but a little interesting thing about international history, or the history of Republican revolutions. Speaking of Republican revolutions, it popped up again in The Age of Revolution, which is another book I've reviewed on this channel by Eric Hobsbawm. Now, Eric Hobsbawm says that the Greek Revolution was like the 19th century version of the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. So in the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s attracted idealists and liberals from all over Europe who went to fight in Spain for the Republican cause. Hobsbawm said the 19th century version of that was the Greek Revolution in the 1920s, which attracted Republicans and idealists from all over Europe who went to fight for Greece for the Republican cause. So at this point, this has popped up in a number of things I've been reading, and I was getting really curious about this, and I wanted to learn more. It sounded like a really interesting event in 19th century idealism and romanticism and you know, the Republican revolutions that were happening at the time. So I went on Amazon to see what books I could track down, because you can track down anything on Amazon these days. And this was the only thing I could find. At least in terms of like a modern history accessible to the modern reader. You know, there's all sorts of scholarly stuff out there. If anyone knows of any other kind of accessible history that's better than this, or just any other accessible history about this, let me know. This was all I could track down. So I ordered this via Amazon and got it delivered. And then read it. And it was, yeah, it was all right for what it was. I did find it a little bit of a slog for reasons I got into. I mean, as I was mentioning before, I was attracted to this period in history because of the idea of romantic Republican revolutions and idealism and the, you know, the international Republican Brotherhood and all those types of things which excited my imagination. Once I actually got into this book, though, I soon got bogged down with all these strange names and all these battles and all these dates which were difficult to keep track of. Now, in retrospect, I totally should have seen this coming, I guess. But if you're completely new to the subject material like I was, it's just overwhelming keeping track of all these names and all these alliances and all these factions and stuff like that, which I guess it would be, right? I mean, imagine somebody who knew nothing about the American Revolution. And all of a sudden was expected to learn all these names and all these different factions and all of these different battles all in one book. It would be a little bit overwhelming. And the Greek Revolution is even more complicated than the American Revolution because in addition to the Republican government, you also have various local and tribal loyalties. I didn't realize this previous to reading this book, but I guess Greece in the 19th century was still a largely tribal society and had tribal governments and tribal loyalties. And you've got to some extent, keep track of this as you're reading the history. As well as the larger story about the Greeks fighting against the Ottoman Empire. Oh, by the way, I should have said this at the outset, but the revolution was against the Ottoman Empire. Greece had previously been conquered by the Ottomans, so this was a revolution against the Ottoman Empire, or a war of independence. It goes by either name. I guess it's similar to the American Revolution in that respect, that you can either call it the War of Independence or the Revolution. Now, I've been living abroad for a number of years, and I've decided, I've got this theory that foreign names are more difficult for me to remember than American names. So, for example, if I meet a group of Americans, and their names are like John, James, and Jim, I can remember them. But when I meet a group of foreigners and they've got kind of strange sounding names to me, I've got a terrible time remembering their names. And yeah, that was a factor with reading this book, where there was a lot of Greek names. For whatever reason, a lot of names that started with a K, Kolokontranus, Koreus, Kondororitis, sorry, I'm mispronouncing them all, I'm sure. I learned all these names by reading them, so I just know their written form. And I couldn't keep them straight. I was constantly going back to the index, all right, who was who again. Now, there's nobody's fault. That's not the author's fault here. It's just, yeah, something you've got to deal with the subject matter. I think the author, David Brewer, does the best as could be expected with a complicating and confusing subject matter. He writes in an easy-to-follow style for the most part. Straightforward prose. I think he does the best he can with the material he has. I don't know if it would be possible to do better with this. I at times wonder. David Brewer is a historian by trade. He writes quite well, but he's a historian, not a journalist. I sometimes find that the histories I enjoy most are sometimes written by journalists who are doing historical research instead of by actual historians. Part of the problem with this book is that there are all these names that are figure large in one part of the history, and then they just disappear as you get into the next segment of the history, and you've got to learn a whole new group of names. And I was wondering a bit if maybe a journalist tackling this period of history would have been better able to make consistent narrative threads. Say, okay, these are the characters that we're going to focus on and we're going to follow their arc over this period, rather than just constantly dropping names and then picking up new names. I don't know if that would be possible or not. I'd be interested to see it attempted. As it is, the history David Brewer has written, each chapter reads very well, but the chapters don't seem to come together in a coherent narrative quite well. Like each chapter is like a separate story. So in the beginning chapters, we learn about the various secret revolutionary societies that began the war. And this is quite interesting. But then once the war kicks off, then kind of the idealism stage drops, and we never hear about these early idealists again. Then all of a sudden we're introduced to several Greek leaders or local politicians. And then the action will switch to describing a certain siege or battle. And then all of a sudden we're done with the story of the politicians and we're into the story of the military. And then a few chapters later the politicians reappear, at which point I've completely forgotten who they were and I needed to go back and remind myself. So each chapter is quite well written. But the book as a whole does give a sense of a dumping ground for everything the author knew about the war. Whereas, like, I could have done with, I don't know, I could have done without getting into the nitty-gritty of some of these sieges quite so much. But I don't know, maybe somebody who's more into military history will quite like that kind of thing. So I guess it depends what you're looking for. Okay, some minor nitpicks. David Brewer leaves quotations in French untranslated, which bugs me because I don't speak French. It's never more than a sentence or two, doesn't seriously impede my understanding, but it was a minor annoyance. Also, I understand he's reluctant to mess with direct quotations, but I wish he would have standardized the spelling. Because for these Greek names, there's a Greek way of spelling it, there's an American way of spelling it, and there's a French way of spelling it. And instead of standardizing the spelling throughout, he tends to just go with the spelling of whatever the source is that he's quoting from. I didn't even realize for a while that this was kind of the same name popping up in different spellings for a while. It caused me some confusion initially. I don't know, what's the etiquette with this? I think there's something to be said for standardizing spelling, even when you're quoting from somebody else in your book. Okay, those minor complaints aside, to get to the positive, this book does certainly have its moments. There was interesting stuff in here. The beginning chapters describing the secret societies and revolutionary agitators, that was really fascinating for me. Once the war breaks out, then it does get bogged down into military history, which I'm not a fan of. Other people might be, but I felt like I got bogged down in descriptions of battles, marches, sieges, other military maneuvers for a while. But then, just when I'm getting a little bit bogged down in the minutia, Brewer pulls back the scope and has some chapters describing the international reaction of other European nations. There was some interesting stuff going on here. Europe was broadly sympathetic to Greece, but there's also some, international politics going on about maintaining the balance of power in Europe and, wanting to keep the Ottoman Empire set up as a buffer to Russia and stuff like that. But then the individual citizens of these European countries were very sympathetic to Greece, and a number of international volunteers came to Greece to fight. Brewer calls them the Philhellenes in the book. And like Hosborn, which I quoted earlier, Brewer makes directly a comparison between the Greek Revolution of the 19th century and the Spanish Civil War of the 20th century. He says on page 135, quote, "Perhaps only in the foreign reactions to the Spanish Civil Wars of the 1830s has there ever been such a sharp contrast between the cold abstention of governments and the passionate involvement of individuals." End quote. Then we get back into the battles, and there's actually an early civil war among the Greeks. So even on the Greek side, they're having a civil war of who's going to control power. And I was starting to get a little bit bored with that. But then David Brewer gives not one, but 2 whole chapters about the story of Lord Byron and his dedication to the Greek cause, which I thought was really interesting. Lord Byron has got to be one of the most fascinating individuals of the 19th century. Worth checking out a biography of him, or I think there's a couple interesting YouTube videos of him. The Mark Steele lectures, I believe. It gives a interesting video on the biography of Lord Byron, which is interesting to check out. But yeah, some very interesting chapters just about Lord Byron and his involvement in the Greek cause in this book. Then the book gets involved in Egypt's involvement in this whole thing. Egypt came in the war. And then finally the involvement of most of Europe in this huge naval battle that destroyed most of the Ottoman Empire's fleet, which was interesting. And then ended with the Greek independence. So, yeah, there's definitely a lot of interesting stuff in here. In my opinion, it never came together as like a whole. But it's a history book. History is messy like that. So I did feel like each chapter was like a separate entity. But maybe that's the way history reads, huh? I mean, I guess be forewarned ahead of time. Each chapter, you kind of have to reacquaint yourself with a whole new set of names, and then in the next chapter, you have to learn a whole new set of names. So for that reason, I would be somewhat cautious about recommending this book to a casual reader, but I'd recommend it nonetheless. Recommend it with caution, but recommend it. There is some really interesting stuff in here.